Welcome to Behind the Screen. This is episode 61, which is kind of hard to believe, but we will be today wrapping up our look at Crossworlds or Portal Fantasy. Have a new book to add to the list. I'm about halfway through Stephen King's new book, Fairy Tale, which very much feels like which very much is a crossworld fantasy. So if you're new here, this is Behind the Screen, where we take a look at gaming, books, board games, and we look at them all from a game designer's and a GM's eye. So it's good to see Mark and Padre in the channel already, in the chat. Good to see you this morning. So today we're going to talk about how can we, if we were going to run a game like this at the table, what are the key things to really bring home the experience for our players. And again, Crossworlds Fantasy is something where we take people from our world and we actually push them into new worlds, new situations, where they get to explore the fantasy, but with the eyes of someone from our world. And so I think that's important. I think, one, you have to start mundane with these games. And a lot of times we're looking for that first initial hook to set the hook and get the players into the action as immediate as possible. When I'm running 2nd edition D&D, when I'm running 13th Age, I usually start with a fight, right? I start at the door of the first dungeon because that immediately gets players invested, immediately moves them in to the fantastical mindset. Good morning, Rook. How are you? If you guys didn't catch it, we did our post-mortem of the horror at Headstone Hill last night, and that's going to be on Twitch this week, and then a Patreon exclusive only going forward from that. So it was a lot of fun to get to hang out with Rook and Lily and Bob at JD1 last time and really chat about the game, what we loved about Savage Worlds, and what we're excited about going forward. So yeah, I think you need to take the time to establish the mundane in a Crossworlds fantasy. Not a long time. I'm not saying like take a whole session, unless you're taking the idea where we have mysteries in both worlds that can only be solved by moving back and forth. So in that case, if you're starting with World of Darkness or a Call of Cthulhu to kind of get the intrigue going, start as if that is the start of the campaign. Set the clues, get the mysteries, get the players to the portal. And Thomas Covenant in Lord Fowl's Bane, the first book, Covenant starts off on a very mundane experience. He's walking down the streets of the town that he lives in, going to pay his electric bill because, damn it, no one else is going to pay it for him. He's a leper. People pay his bills, they send food just so they don't have to deal with the fact of a leper coming into town. So I think there's something about that. It's not the same genre, but the Masks of Nyarlathotep starts off very similar. You start off going to a funeral, a very mundane thing. You get picked up into a mystery. And it's not until you get to the Juju house that you discover that you step through the looking glass into a Lovecraftian pit of horrors. So I would say start with the mundane and then move into the fantastical. Also give them a clear transition. Lucy goes through the wardrobe. Covenant passes out. Eddie steps through the door in Drawing of the Three. There has to be a clear delineation, a clear boundary. It's why it's called Portal Fantasy, because there has to be a transition when you take the character sheets away and you give the new character sheets, or where you give the overlays, the templates that you set out. And I think in this case, I would ignore my typical advice to new players and new GMs to remind them, hey, your character knows more about this world than you do. In Crossworld Fantasies, they do not. You don't have culture own or networking or common knowledge skills to lean back on. That was a great game, Rook. Yes, probably. In Crossworlds Fantasy, ignorance is dangerous. Players don't know, the heroes of Crossworlds Fantasies don't know the rules, and that usually leads them to getting into trouble in the new world. They know the rules of their world. They don't know the rules of this new world. knowledge has to be earned, and in that earning of knowledge there is always a mistake that is made, a trauma that is inflicted, or an enemy that is set up because the rules are unknown. Lucy doesn't know the rules of Narnia. Edmund doesn't know the rules of Narnia, so Edmund ends up taking that for granted, ends up betraying his siblings and taking Turkish delight, which again is not that great. It's sort of the kind of the epitome of how little we're actually willing to sell for. So, right, there's this moment of a Covenant. Covenant commits an atrocity because he thinks the world is a dream, and that haunts him for the rest of the series. You've gotta earn the knowledge. Now, I'm not saying be stingy, be purposefully obtuse, but know that for your characters and to your players, you got to let them know that this is the way this is. They're exploring the world through the eyes of somebody from our world, so they can make assumptions, but they really need to learn the rules of the world. A crazy way you could do this is not give them new character sheets, and as they start to ask to do things, give them pieces of their character sheet that they have to basically then build together to figure out what game they're playing, so they know the rules of the game. That's like next level mind messery. So I'm not sure I would necessarily recommend that, but if you are a devious and diabolical GM and your players enjoy that kind of tomfoolery, please feel free to use it. If you use it, leave a note in the comment. I would love to hear how that goes. Thanks, John and Rook. I love this shirt. My players got it for me. And Rook, I appreciate that you don't think I would run out of stories. I appreciate that. Actually, I'm this morning before Behind the Screen, I'm looking at outlining an anthology of short stories that I want to write. I can't figure out what world to set it in because I have so many ideas and so many worlds that I just like to pick up the Legos with and play with. So I will have to figure that out as well. Thank you, Phantom. I feel like this shirt has gotten the most comments out of any of the shirts I have written or worn on Behind the Screen. So the other thing is keep the characters off balance, and the players as well. Switch when they least expect it. When you're, right after the climactic battle, have them go back to the other world. Right before a horrible accident in our world, transition them. As Padre pointed out, Lucy doesn't remember the rules of Narnia in Voyage of the Dawn Treader. The time jump kind of adds into this. If you jump the time ahead every time you make the switch, you end up with the rules changing. The Pevensey children think they know the rules for Narnia, and they go back in Caspian, and what do they find? That no one remembers them. That the castle is, Cair Paravel is in ruins, and what was once a peninsula is now an island. Covenant goes back to find the war continuing to move on, and then at the end of the first Chronicles, there's a 10,000 year difference. Nothing that he knew about the land is true anymore, and it's his stubborn tenacity of holding to the old rules that helps him find a piece of the true land. But in the meanwhile, he suffers horribly, gets infected by the venom. We have consequences to ignorance in Crossworlds Fantasy that I think is something I try to avoid in normal games. When you're running a game, you don't want your players to be penalized because they don't know the rules of the world yet, right? The idea that your character in the game knows more about the game and the world than you do is an adage that I hold to. So especially with new players, I'm like, you can always ask questions because your character knows more about the setting than you do. If there's something you think your character should know, ask it. It's why I feel so strongly about it. It's why I put it as a skill in Jackals. Culture own, culture other, lore, and ancient lore. There's actually 4 skills for it in my game. So, Mark says I should go full Conan and just be shirtless while I do that. And when I when I finally finish my Conan physique rebuild, Mark, I will do that. Perhaps we would get more viewers. Um, maybe not. We get less viewers. So, yes, Padre, Aslan doesn't even play by his own rules, which I think is brilliant. So, the other thing is, we talked a lot about allegory, and allegory sometimes gets a bad rap, but I think in Crossworld Fantasy, it's sort of necessary. You need to have those multiple layers of reality that tie back to each other. So, I think the best example of this is, of course, the Thomas Covenant Chronicles. The first ones, because as soon as you get to the second and third Chronicles, other people from our world are coming across with Covenant, and so the idea that maybe the land is a dream is no longer real. He tries to touch on it, but I think as soon as you have somebody else who comes with him and then becomes a point of view character, the idea that this is all Covenant's dream fails. And I think he lets it go, which I am okay with. I like the second Chronicles a lot, and the third Chronicles as well. But if you pay close attention to that opening story, the opening chapter of Lord Fowl's Bane, everything that Covenant encounters is there in the real world. It's just distorted. So he sees the giant heads of statues on buildings, and he meets giants in the land. There are more things that let you believe that this is maybe just Covenant taking in his surroundings and reinterpreting them through his subconscious. So allegory, I think, is very strong in this. You want the things in one world to affect and have a place in the others, almost with a fairy tale logic in Crossworlds Fantasy. I believe it was Lewis who said, fairy tales are stories where people wear their insides on their outsides. And I think that's super important for this. You need to have that, hey, the group is facing bullies, or, man, it would be great to do kids on bikes for the first half of the game, the real world game. Play kids on bikes or Tales from the Loop, and then have them fall through into Dungeons and Dragons. I mean, that's basically the story of the D&D cartoon from the 80s, isn't it? Right? Kids from our world end up in the other world. But if they're fighting bullies, those bullies should be bigger, badder, meaner, more terrifying in the other world, so that they can confront them and gain the strength to go back and deal with their other issues. If they're dealing with a mystery in one world, it ties into the mystery in the other world, but the fantasy world, that mystery needs to be blown up, it needs to be magnified, it may need to be melodramatic to really hammer the point across, so when they return to our world, they know how to deal with it. Why is that, John Doom? So John Doom says, anytime I talk about Narnia, he keeps hearing Lazy Sunday, Mr. Pibb, and Red Vines equals crazy delicious. Yes, Padre, I would agree with that. Padre said that Torg Eternity uses the Day One adventures, which, plug, I just so happen to have sitting next to me if I can get it. Yeah, so this is the Day One adventures. So this is, you start off in our world, and during the first scene, you get swept up into the new cosm, and it explains the world rules to you. It's a great book if you want to get into Torg and see what it's like. So yes, kind of the same way. You start off very mundane. I've run the Isle adventure several times. The Isle adventure is, you're all on a field trip, or you're all in Trafalgar Square for a variety of reasons when it all hits. The Maelstrom Bridge comes down, and suddenly you're in Isle and dealing with the changes that brings. So those are some things I think you should focus on. Now, what are some pitfalls about this experience? Ah, yes, John. I knew that sounded familiar. The Lonely Island Narnia rat. Thank you. Some pitfalls from this is, if you don't explain what you're doing to your players, it can pull the rug out from them, and they may hit the ground hard. If you say, hey, we're going to play Call of Cthulhu or Tales from the Loop or World of Darkness, and then you just, without warning, shunt them into another world and hand them D&D character sheets, there may be some pushback, some resistance, some frustration about the bait and switch. So when that happens, I think it's okay and probably necessary to, if that comes up, take a step back and say, hey guys, here's what I'm trying to do. Maybe even in your session 0, explain, hey, I want to run this really unique thing that I've been noodling about. I'm asking you to trust me if you don't want to spoil the surprise. If your players don't care about that and you want to spoil the surprise, that's fine. But just treat that first transition a little easy, with a little bit of kid gloves and a little bit of grace, because your players, right? One of our greatest sources of frustration in our lives are unmet expectations, especially when we've never vocalized them. When we expect somebody to do something and we've never said, hey, here's our expectation, and when they don't meet it, we immediately have frustration. Key aspect of, in my life, of learning to lessen frustration is to set good expectations. So that little piece of life advice, totally free, just a added benefit of tuning into Behind the Screen. So I think that's a way to look at it. I think you need to be prepared for some frustration and have a way to deal with that. Some other thing is, you may find that some of your group loves one of the stories and some of your group loves the other stories. That's okay. Just as a GM, navigate that back and forth. Listen to your players, listen to how they're talking about things, listen to how they're talking about the game, so you know where to set that dial of how much mundane and how much fantastical. And then reward your players who dig into it, who really kind of figure out, hey, there's a connection here, let's move the story forward. I feel like Crossworlds Fantasy is not a great sandbox genre to play in, like Sword and Sandals or high fantasy or grimdark, where you're exploring the world. I think a lot like epic fantasy, you really want a through line for Crossworld Fantasy, and some players may balk at that. That's okay, right? There's a reason why we have a ton of different games. Heck, just on the shelves behind me, I have a ton of different games. There's a ton of different GMing advice. Let your players have agency, but like, understand that most Crossworlds fantasies, because they're tied together, because there's a clear reason why the players were drawn into this world, there's going to be a story there that the players are going to explore and experience. And some players may not like some guardrails set on them. So again, good expectations, good communication, and you'll find that much of this gets smoothed over. So that's the end of our discussion on Crossworld Fantasy. I hope you enjoyed it. We're going to take a break from this series. I'm going to do a review on Thursday. I haven't figured out what I want to do a review on. It may be something lying about here. Probably something lying about here. And then we're going to be on Saturday talking about Pappas and the Big Rubble, Evan and I, on Exploring Glorantha, if you'd like to join us. And then Sunday, Mark, who's in the chat, and Becca and I will be reviewing Double Tap for Nice Black Agents and this massive campaign, the Dracula Dossier for Nice Black Agents. And then next week, we're going to start our look at science fiction and what genres, kind of doing the same thing we did with fantasy, but with science fiction. We're looking at military science fiction, hard sci-fi, space opera, space fantasy, near sci-fi, cyberpunk, the whole gamut. So I am really looking forward to digging into that with you all. And thank you to everybody who is on here, who supports the show, who is a constant viewer. I'm looking forward to just continuing this show with you. And we're going to be back next week with some Savage Rifts one-shot. I will have more to talk about that next week on Tuesday. So until next time, stay safe, stay healthy, stay gaming. I am JM. This has been Behind the Screen, and I will see you all on Thursday.